American exceptionalism often gets a bad rap, and justifiably so, since it's usually invoked to cover racism or militarism. But there's one way in which the US has always been exceptional. Very few other democracies on Earth share our two-party system of government. It's not in the Constitution, but today the struggle for power between Republicans and Democrats is a seemingly permanent fixture of our political culture. In other major democracies, you have multi-party systems. There may be two dominant parties, but they're dependent on the smaller political factions to build ruling coalitions. And if they grow too radical or too anti-democratic or extreme, they tend to implode or fragment into smaller parties. America is different. Our two-party system determines not just control of the White House, the Congress, and the courts. It determines how the post office will be run. It determines how the Securities and Exchange Commission pursues stock manipulators and inside traders, if at all. From 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to your local school board, virtually every part of your life is dominated by the struggle between these two parties. So what happens to that system when one of those two parties goes insane, dropping its commitment to democracy, to constitutional norms, to the rule of law, and even to the very fabric of our reality, when even lifelong members of that party have trouble defining the party except in terms of war?
If you had to define what a Republican is now, as it stands right now, how would you define it?
Oh, Josh, this is a tough one, because today's Republican is simply somebody that believes that Democrats are evil. That's it. That's all it is. That's all it takes.
That's no lefty. That's Rina Shah. She was an RNC delegate and a senior aide to two Republican members of Congress. And what she says is backed up by decades of right-wing media. It started with books called Liberal Fascism and How to Talk to a Liberal If You Must, and The Enemy Within. And if you believe that the only other party in this democratic system is evil, it's only a small step to believing democracy is evil, because it gives your enemies a chance to win. Some political scientists call this the doom loop. Quote, once the parties polarize in a two-party system, the danger is that polarization becomes a self-reinforcing dynamic, a doom loop. And thanks to a congenitally dishonest debt salesman named Donald J. Trump, Republicans are riding that doom loop down to the ground floor. A CBS News YouGov poll released this week shows that 2/3 of Republicans believe the 2020 election was stolen from Trump. But even more alarming, half of Republicans seem to have given up on democracy. The poll asked those Republicans, should the party focus on developing popular policies and ideas to win over more voters, or should it prioritize changes to the voting rules in states and districts? A whopping 47% chose the latter option. Instead of offering better ideas, they want Republicans to make voting harder. But surely the Republican Party and the American political system can be saved by real leadership. Nah. In Arizona, Republicans in the state Senate continue their phony, conspiracy-ridden audit of more than 1 million ballots cast in the 2020 election. And on Monday, the Republican-led Board of Supervisors in Maricopa County, where most of those ballots came from, said they'd had enough.
Okay, I want to keep this part of the circus as short as possible. We will be reviewing a response to the state Senate president's attempt at legitimizing a grift disguised as an audit.
You all have been subjected to 6 months of harassment. Supervisor Hickman has even been accused of feeding ballots to hundreds of thousands of chickens at his farm and then purposefully incinerating them.
When I sent a letter out saying tone down the political rhetoric, and it created death threats and 90 people showing up to my house on a Sunday night saying I was not doing the oath of my office.
Wow. Meanwhile, in Washington, Democrats continue to fight for a bipartisan commission to investigate the causes and aftermath of the deadly Capitol insurrection. But House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy threw cold water on that idea this morning. Why? Because instead of scrutinizing Black Lives Matter or Antifa, it was going to look at the Trump supporters and right-wing militias who actually stormed the Capitol that day. This is the same Kevin McCarthy who hid from the insurrectionists and tried to get Donald Trump's attention by calling into Fox News live during the attack, where he called the insurrection, quote, un-American. All of this insanity, this denial of reality, this renunciation of democracy is goaded on by Trump himself, who is now publishing unhinged rants to his own presidential-looking Twitter-style website. Last Saturday, he called the election he'd lost, quote, the crime of the century. 2 hours later, he published more lies about the Arizona ballot audit. Quote, the mainstream media and radical left Democrats want to stay as far away as possible from the presidential election fraud. And do you remember that CBS YouGov poll I mentioned earlier about half of Republicans rejecting democracy? On Sunday, Trump celebrated it. Quote, 67% of Republicans said they do not consider sleepy Joe Biden to be the legitimate winner of the 2020 presidential election. I agree with them 100%. In this atmosphere, politicians, and not just in Arizona, don't just worry that insufficient Trumpiness could cost them re-election. They worry that it could cost them their lives.
But when you receive death threats from hundreds of Republicans around the country, that's a problem when you're only sitting there telling the truth.
Is it true that you and your family have been subjected to death threats, too, in recent days?
Yes. It's pretty disgusting when it's your own party doing that.
I'm at 36 days free from death threats. So it's been over a month, so it's a new milestone for us.
Those are all Republicans from Georgia being threatened by other Republicans. Look, our entire system of government, of civil society, depends on two parties accepting each other as legitimate vehicles for competing ideas, not as armies hell-bent on each other's destruction. Republicans are now showing America where that second option leads. They aren't merely waging war against Democrats. They are waging war against democracy, against a system that allows any party to compete with them. Come 2024, do you really think a Republican-controlled House and Senate is going to certify a victory by a Democrat? And then what happens to democracy? Then what happens to this country? Joining me now are Ruth Ben-Ghiat, history professor at NYU and author of the book Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, and Norman Ornstein, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and co-author of It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. Thank you both for coming back on the show. And let me begin by asking you both briefly, do you believe a Republican-controlled Congress will allow a Democratic nominee for president who wins in 2024 to take office? Yes or no? Ruth?
No, I don't. The way things are going.
No. Norm?
No. And, with the laws that we're seeing in all of these states, if we saw a Democrat win handily, I think we would see enough states throw it to the Republican Congress to overturn the results.
Yeah, that's my view too, and it's a pretty depressing start to our conversation, but it kind of sets up what a bind we are in as a country, as a democracy right now. And Ruth, let me come back to you. Conversations about authoritarianism and anti-democratic forces can often be very abstract. But the Republicans are authoritarian in very concrete ways right now. We just heard the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia talking about getting death threats from other Republicans. This is a party that has a former president that has basically foot soldiers, insurrectionists, oath keepers, Proud Boys, rank-and-file Republicans who don't want to accept reality. Back in December, a Pennsylvania Republican senator said if she didn't back Trump's election challenge, quote, I'd get my house bombed tonight. Ruth, you literally wrote the book on Mussolini. Does that sound like black shirts to you?
It sounds like the whole history of authoritarianism. And, the true American exceptionalism has never been democracy, but the ability of citizens to have so many guns. And so we have a uniquely dangerous situation because we have, as you said at the outset, a bipartisan democracy in which one of the two parties is turned toward autocracy. So what do? And a situation where more people than ever are owning guns, which you saw with the results of that on January 6th. And there's been an evolution from the demonization of political opponents, which started with Hillary Clinton, lock her up, lock up the press, to this authoritarian-style party discipline, which evolved. It's hard when we're in the middle of history being made to see that slowly these things are happening. But by the time the election came, the GOP had already started to squash internal dissent. And this is why it already had evolved into an authoritarian political culture. This is why January 6th, the shock of it, instead of prompting some kind of reckoning and reconciliation with the rule of law, I actually believe it's been like an electrification into further lawlessness and further radicalization.
Yes. Yes, it has. And Norm, you and Thomas Mann came out with your book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, in 2012. It called the Republican Party an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme. And I remember you got criticized for being alarmist, but in a way you were almost too restrained. I mean, did you ever imagine back then that this party would become what it is today within a decade?
I didn't think it would happen within a decade, and I thought that there would be more internal dissent from this kind of dissent. But, you know, back then, in the one other excerpt from the book that we did in the Post, we talked about the cult-like atmosphere that was developing in the Republican Party. And I think there are two words here that really need to be emphasized. Tribalism, which is what started this process going back a couple of decades. Newt Gingrich really deliberately tribalized. Rush Limbaugh and others contributed to that. And that's why the statement that they believe that Democrats are evil and that they're trying to destroy our way of life gives them the legitimacy they believe to do almost anything. The ends justify the means. But the other is cult. It's almost a fanatic religious cult. And it was a cult before Trump. But when you get a cult leader like Trump, then you get a group of people who do almost anything that he says. And we just can't ignore either, Mehdi, the role of the Murdochs, the Fox hosts, and the other tribal media who have reinforced all of this and created this false narrative that people believe, including people who wouldn't start out having these kinds of authoritarian views, but have been gulled into believing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we even heard Liz Cheney saying that to Fox, on Fox, that Fox has a role to play in her own decapitation and the extremism of her party. Ruth, put the GOP in an international context for our viewers. Where does the current Republican Party rank in comparison to, say, some of the far-right authoritarian parties that you see in Eastern Europe, like Viktor Orban's in Hungary? Or are we in new territory here? There is no analog for the modern GOP internationally.
No, there are analogs. And in fact, during the Trump presidency, there were already comparative politics studies coming out showing that for its platforms and its rhetoric, the GOP lined up with, in some cases, with Modi's party, in India, with Erdogan's party, with far-right parties. And so this is part of its abandonment of the political culture of democracy. It had already done this. And now what it's doing is, again, this kind of electrification. Trump is out for the moment, but at the state level, the things that they're passing, all the bills, are part of the international autocracy menu, from voter suppression to anti-trans legislation to criminalization of protest and other things like this. And of course, really, the way I see, picking up what Norm was saying, and this happens over and over from Mussolini on, you have a leader who comes and kind of channels and focuses existing anti-democratic and extremist tendencies. And this focus is important because he gives it a momentum, and he gives the followers someone to believe in. And the classic thing is, if they believe in him, they will believe whatever he says. And this has been the effect of the Trump persona, let's say.
One other thing I'd like to add.
So I remember Donald Trump's. Go on, Norm. Yes.
We're talking about their turn to authoritarianism. There's another element of this, and I think it also fits what Ruth has been saying, and I'm delighted to be on with this great authority on authoritarianism. And that is, a cult has a theology, not an ideology. And the theology here is that government is evil, all government is bad. If we could get rid of it, everything would be wonderful. And that if any part of government works, that's bad because people will like it and they'll want more of it. And what's so significant about the fact that the Republicans ruled for a period of time is that their governance was horrific. At the border, 400 to 500,000 people unnecessarily killed, more than in World War I and World War II, because of the bad governance provided by this horrible figure, Donald Trump, and all the people around him. So in power, it wasn't just authoritarianism, it was murderous, horrible kakistocracy. So it's a double-edged sword with each side having a strong blade that cuts into the ability of America to govern itself well.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion with you both is, as you say, the Republican Party has become this cult, as we've discussed on this show, but it's within the context of a two-party system, and that makes the whole thing is on edge. The whole thing is at risk, because I don't understand personally how a two-party system can survive when one party is, as you both have described it for us today. Ruth, Norm, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time, but always appreciate your analysis and your insights. Thank you.